Your Eminences, Reverend clergy, my colleagues in public service, brothers and sisters, we're gathered here again, as we have gathered every year, next to this monument that has stood for a half century. We're gathered again in unity and in strength, but we're also gathered at an especially important time for our nation. And it's such an honor to be able to be here today with great friends and champions like our extraordinary Mayor, Eric Garcetti, like our greatest congressional hero, Adam Schiff, like a hero to all nations who care about truth, Ambassador John Evans. And it's especially important that we're gathered together today because these are in many ways dark times when it comes to genocide recognition and those who would deny it. We've seen in the last week or so a campaign of Turkish denial that has reached absurd and disgusting heights. Just in the last week, we've seen skywriters over the city of New York spreading Turkish propaganda messages. We've seen full-page ads written in the Wall Street Journal denying the genocide. I'm very proud to have introduced a motion calling upon the city of Los Angeles to cancel all of its subscriptions to the Wall Street Journal just yesterday, by the way. We've seen billboards placed by the same denialists. We've even seen American youth dance teams being paid for by Turkish sources to wear Turkish flag t-shirts and do dance routines in New York and elsewhere. It's ridiculous, and we all know it's ridiculous, but it's also no coincidence. Because friends, this is not just about genocide denial anymore. I believe that the campaign that we're seeing now is not so much about 1915. It's about distracting the world's attention from the crimes of today. The threats to Armenians and others in Syria, the threats that we see of atrocities committed by ISIS, the threats we see to our cultural heritage and our history with the desecration and destruction of cemeteries at Julfa, at churches, at Deir ez-Zor, and throughout the Middle East. And most importantly of all, I believe it's intended to distract our attention from the existential threat faced right now by the people of Artsakh. So, I say to my government, I'm sorry that once again you're failing us in recognizing the Armenian Genocide. I think that that is a shame as an American because it denies America's history as a beacon of hope and it denies our American values. But I say to them, if you don't have the strength or the courage to speak truth about what happened in 1915, at least have the courage to speak truth about what is happening right now, in 2016, as we are gathered here today. If you are too weak, if you, the most powerful government in the history of the world, if you are too weak or too intimidated to risk offending a Turkish president who disrespects America, who supports and enables ISIS murderers, then at least follow in the proud tradition of American leaders who came to the aid of Armenians in 1915 who were facing destruction, and come to our aid, come to help the Armenians who are today facing destruction by the same forces of evil. Artsakh must be America's cause. When we see what the Artsakhi's have stood up for, when we see the courage that they've demonstrated, we have to see them as the torchbearers who are continuing to carry the torch that was lit in our own country in the 18th century. When we think about the Boston Tea Party, we as Americans take great pride in the idea that a small band of heroes stood up against the mightiest empire on earth, and they had the courage to speak out about oppression that they were facing then. But when we think about the Boston Tea Party, we should equally think and take pride in those Armenians who stood up in Stepanakert and in Yerevan and faced down the tanks of the Soviet Union with fists in the air saying, Karabakh, Karabakh, Karabakh. When we as Americans take pride in the strength and the persistence of the American forces under George Washington, who in the winter of 1777 encamped in Valley Forge with no hope of victory, no hope of even surviving that winter, but they continued to stay strong for their cause. When we think of those heroes as Americans, we should also take great pride in the heroes of Shushi, who climbed hand over hand up the cliffs from that gorge. When we hear this general here before us today, we should think of those heroes who died on that cliff in order to liberate Shushi and turn the course of that war and bring freedom and liberty to Artsakh. And when we take pride in our own Declaration of Independence, a document that people throughout the world take inspiration from, what was that if it wasn't the inspiration for those people in Artsakh who again had the courage to declare their independence from the Soviet Union, their independence from Azerbaijan, and continue to declare, just as our forefathers declared with their life, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, a commitment to that idea, so have the people of Artsakh, and so must we as Americans stand with them in that continuing quest. And so, to my government, to the elected officials of my government, I ask you to join Assemblymember Nazarian and I and sign a letter, which you will be getting from us soon. Sign a letter to our president calling for a permanent peace respecting the boundaries of Artsakh. A permanent recognition by the United States of America of Artsakh as a free and independent and sovereign state. I ask you to join in calling for United States aid to the people of Artsakh and a permanent end to support for Azerbaijan. And one more thing, I ask President Obama and our government to investigate the atrocities and war crimes that we know have been committed yet again by the Azerbaijanis against Armenian people in that part of the world. But my friends, don't count on just the elected officials to get that done. This is not the job of the people we elect. It is the job of the people who elect them, and that's you. So you need to come together and make these demands. We stand in unity here today. We need to stand in unity again tomorrow when we stand together at the Turkish consulate, and I ask all of you to join us at the Rally for Justice at 1 o'clock p.m. tomorrow at the Turkish consulate. You must show up and demand justice for our cause, justice for our martyrs, but you must also demand action today. On Monday, when we're done with the end of the centennial year of the commemoration of the genocide, that's the time to begin work fighting for Artsakh. You need to do it, my friends. Almost 100 years ago, there were only a few Armenians left still fighting against Turkish atrocities during the middle of the genocide. And they were surrounded, and like those American soldiers at Valley Forge, they had no hope of success either. They had no hope of survival, as they were surrounded at Sardarabad by forces much more powerful and much better armed than they. But the Armenians heard the bells of Echmiadzin, and they rallied to that cause. Armenians everywhere, civilians, elderly people, shopkeepers, teachers, men, women, stood up and went to Sardarabad, went to the aid of the forces there, and saved the Armenian people from destruction. The moral of that story, and the moral that we have to remember now, is don't ever quit. We're all frustrated that our government is continuing to to side with Turkey and not acknowledge our genocide, but you must not quit. Remember our ancestors who overcame genocide and didn't quit. Remember the Artsaksis who today face destruction. They won't quit. You must not quit either. Do as they did. Sometimes justice takes time. And Martin Luther King said that justice too long delayed is justice denied. But at the same time, let's as Americans remember the civil rights movement. And remember that African Americans were enslaved in this country, their culture destroyed, their people murdered and raped. We fought a civil war in this country to free those slaves. And at that time, a great American named Harriet Tubman helped to lead some of those slaves out of bondage, breaking the chains of bondage and to freedom. And it wasn't for more than 100 years after the end of that Civil War before African Americans were guaranteed the right to vote in this country. Sometimes justice takes time. So as we fight for justice, I hope you'll remember the words of Harriet Tubman, who told those slaves escaping from bondage to freedom, when she said, "If you hear the dogs, keep going. If you see the torches in the woods, keep going. If they're shouting after you, keep going. Don't ever stop. Keep going. If you want a taste of freedom, keep going." My friends, as long as there is one child singing Armenian songs, we will keep going. As long as we have a little corner of the world that we can call our own, we will keep going. As long as there are two stones of an Armenian church still held together, we will keep going. As long as there is one Armenian on this earth with air in their lungs, we shall keep going. Fight on.
Fight on is true. Our history has taught a lot. Mr. Krekorian, knowing the Armenian people, we will